According to Christianity Today, one of the top books of 2012 was a book called The Juvenilization of American Christianity by author Thomas Bergler. Now, Bergler's thesis is this, that American Christians are stuck in a stage of adolescence. Adolescence to me is a very interesting concept because really prior to the 20th century, you didn't have a stage of life called adolescence. In most countries, most cultures throughout the history of the world, kids went from being kids to being adults, and they had some kind of rite of passage right in the middle. But somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, you had a group of psychiatrists that looked at transitional developments and said, oh, there's this stage of life called adolescence. And then you had pop culture that really kicked in. You know, for example, in the 50s, Chubby Checker and the Twist. That was significant because before that, the kids went to the adult dances and dressed like the adults. Now kids are going to the kids' dances and the adults on the outside. By the 1960s, everybody had an automobile, so the adults aren't there at all. And then there was this group of people called advertisers that realized this was a lot of money to be made by American teenagers. And poof, you have adolescence. Now, adolescence was supposed to be a transitional stage. You went from being a kid to being an adolescent to being an adult. That transition stage from about the ages of 13 to 18. Well, the National Academy of Sciences today actually puts the stage of adolescence as the stage of life between the ages of 11 and 30. We have this whole new phenomenon called the Peter Pan syndrome, or failure to launch. In other words, kids are becoming adolescents even at an earlier age, but they're not leaving adolescence towards a later age. Now, Bergler's thesis is that American Christianity is trapped in adolescence. What are some of the characteristics of adolescence? Well, first of all, a sense of entitlement, that God owes me something, right? That, not that I'm supposed to really give, but that God really owes me something. Sociologist Christian Smith has called this moralistic therapeutic deism. Another characteristic of adolescence, at least in America, is that it's very closely tied with consumerism. We kind of see all of life as a shopping experience. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, but for us, it's I shop, therefore I am. And so everything we experience, whether it's the mall or TV or entertainment or the church, we see as consumers. I'm giving my time and my money, and I expect a good experience in return. I expect a good speaker in return. I expect a great worship set in return. And this brings up another characteristic of adolescence, which is that it's highly emotional. Oftentimes, how I feel is way more important than how I think or how I live. When you ask Christians, especially many young Christians, when have you felt more close to God? They often point back to an experience, maybe a stadium event where the music was rocking and the lights were going up and down and that speaker was just highly motivational. You don't hear that they felt close to Jesus when they walked with someone through deep suffering, or when they spent time giving of themselves to someone else, or when they just piled through a very difficult time when God seems distant, but they stayed committed to prayer. Now the question is, if the gospel that we embrace is one of emotionalism and one of big events and a lot of noise, is it big enough to help us walk through the next generation of challenges that we're going to face as Christians, especially American Christians? We know that the faith that we have is fun and emotive, but what if it gets really difficult? In fact, I think a bigger faith is not only big enough to help us through the good times and the difficult times, but the biggest faith helps us through the mundane times, where we just have to show up to community, show up to service, show up to prayer. You know, an incident in Jesus' life that reminds me of kind of a similar situation is the Triumphal Injury. As the way John tells the story, in chapter 11, Jesus goes and heals Lazarus. And if Jesus was kind of a hidden secret, after that point, he's not. People are flocking to him. Lazarus is proclaiming what happened to him so much that the Pharisees not only want to kill Jesus, they want to kill Lazarus to shut him up. In fact, Jesus actually says after that, my time has come. And he marches in to Jerusalem. And all the people line up with palm branches and they wave, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna. If you know the backdrop of this, it's very interesting. They did the same thing to Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus helped free the Jews from some tyrants, and he helped restore the temple, and they followed him with those palm branches. And what they see now is Jesus as another deliverer. In fact, he's riding on a donkey, and the Israelites would know that the prophecy from Zechariah, which said he's going to, the Messiah is going to come on a donkey. They know who Jesus is. It's not a secret anymore. But those same people are the ones who a week later are saying, we have no king but Caesar. A week later, they're saying, crucify him, crucify him. Why? Because they expected the Messiah to do things a particular way. They were there for the noise and the excitement. They were ready for the battle. They were ready for freedom. But what they weren't ready for is the freedom that Jesus was actually coming to give, which is a freedom from their own sin, a freedom from their own captivity. He's going to do it through peace. He's going to do it through suffering. He's going to do it through trial. And even his own disciples in Gethsemane could not wait and pray with him for the hours that he needed them to. A juvenile Christianity is not one that can handle the hard times, and it's not one that can handle the mundane. But the real gospel, the gospel that Jesus walks through to accomplish in the Holy Week, is one that goes through the dredges of service, goes through the dredges of persecution, of suffering, and of course of death. And that's what we're going to talk about the next several weeks here on ReEngage. Thanks for joining us.